Welcome to Got Grass, conversations with the legends and leaders of bluegrass. You've enjoyed live bluegrass at Guitar Town CT concerts in Hampton, Connecticut since 2008. From Tony Rice, Rouse Stanley, and Doyle Lawson to Tim O'Brien, Sierra Hall, and Billy Strings. Now you can go behind the scenes as we chat with your favorite bluegrass stars. I'm your podcast host, Chris Worth. Well, Jon Weisberger wears many hats in the music world. He's a talented and prolific writer, producer, songwriter, and musician, and I'm just very happy to have him here on Got Grass. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
This is our 30th episode, and it's been a lot of fun for me. It's a lot easier than producing music concerts.
I'll bet. Podcasting is, I think, a pretty exciting development in general, and as it relates to our kind of bluegrass and related music in particular. It's really a great way to get information out to people.
I was going to ask you at the end of this, would you ever do a podcast, or do you do a podcast? Because you certainly know the right questions to ask people.
Right. It's a possibility sometime in the future. I will say I've given it a little bit of thought, but right now it falls pretty low on my to-do list. I've got a lot of other things that keep me pretty busy. So something for the indefinite future, maybe.
You sound like a busy guy from what I know about you. So, So I almost feel like my first question should be to you. What do you want to talk about? Even though I have a whole list of questions. I've never started with that one. It's a little open-ended.
Well, anything that you'd like to talk about, I'm good on.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I always start with a non-music question, which is, if you had a day off, what would it be like for you? No music.
A day off. Typically, if I had a day off outside of my regular weekly schedule, if I somehow had an eighth day magically dropped into my week, I would probably spend a good chunk of it at least hiking around in the beautiful mountains here where I live in Western North Carolina. It's a gorgeous area. I live in Brevard, which is a little town just kind of on the edge. It's the gateway to the Pisgah National Forest on the western side of Asheville. And there's some beautiful trails up in the mountains. I didn't realize how much I would like living in the mountains until I moved here, but it's really beautiful. So that would be my starting point anyhow for an extra day off.
Yeah. Is your area still recovering from floods, or were you spared any of that?
Brevard itself fared pretty well during and post Hurricane Helene. I was actually at the IBMA, at the International Bluegrass Music Association annual conference over in Raleigh, which is a few hours away, when the hurricane came through. I had a nervous couple of days where I couldn't get hold of my wife, but made it back to town. Power came back on at our house. The town itself suffered little damage. There's some more in the surrounding county, and down in Asheville got hit really hard in some other areas, but we did not do too badly. My family personally were basically unaffected. So that's very grateful.
I know Asheville got really, really badly ruined, parts of it. I know, I've been following it on the news. So everybody, I think, knows who you are, but if you had to sum yourself up in a short bio, what would you say about yourself? Just for those people that might not know who Jon Weisberger is.
Sure. I have on social media, where there's a little space for a bio, I have something like songwriter, record producer, bass player, and then I like to say bluegrass. Compulsive bluegrass community builder and rabble rouser. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. I've worn, as you said, a lot of different hats in the industry. Songwriter and bass player, kind of the through line, going back to my first involvement in bluegrass many years ago. I've done radio, done broadcasting. I did from 2006 until 2018. I was doing a radio show, mostly on satellite radio with Doyle McCoury every week. So that was a lot of fun. And for the last 5 years, I've been an A&R director at at Crossroads Label Group, which includes Mountain Home, a music company here outside of Asheville. And I do a variety of things there and also produce records. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Big nutshell. Do you remember a certain time in your life when you heard a piece of music when you were younger and said, aha, that's what I want to be. That's what I want to do. Was there an aha moment for you, or?
Not a particular moment, I would say. I grew up, I found many years ago, I found a picture of myself at age 3 holding a recorder. And so I've been playing music literally all my life. And probably the biggest aha moment, at least one relevant to my career of the last couple of decades, has been I started listening to country music in the mid 60s, and that included bluegrass, but I was a little bit of a throwback in the sense that I didn't really think of bluegrass as a separate style of music. I just thought of it as part of country music, which of course that's where it came from historically. And so it really wasn't until I bought an album. I was in New York City in the late 70s, I guess it was, and I bought an album by Red Allen and the Kentuckians. And for some reason, that was the record that really grabbed me and got me so enthusiastic about bluegrass in particular that everything kind of flowed from there. That's when I sort of pivoted to really zero in on bluegrass music in particular. So Red Allen, I blame Red Allen.
Blame Red. Yeah, my first real exposure to that kind of music was the album Will the Circle Be Unbroken, which was, for a lot of people, especially up here who are not part of the bluegrass world, was like, wow, this is stuff we never even imagined.
Yeah. No, I remember when that album came out, but again, like I said, and particularly because Roy Acuff was on it, Mother Mabel Carter, and so it was really, it kind of exemplified that sort of hillbilly music combination or general category of from back in the 40s and 50s, and great record. I wrote an essay about it for No Depression some years ago, and it was interesting because I talked to even a number of bluegrass musicians cited that album in particular. I remember Glenn Duncan, the great fiddle player, mentioning that album was what really woke him up to bluegrass music in particular.
There was really a wide array of talent of all. I mean, it wasn't country bluegrass; it was all kinds of stuff on there, which was really, really eye-opening. I'm thinking that the divergence between country and bluegrass is pretty stark now. Do you remember kind of when and how that happened in a general sense? Can you put your finger on that? It's just become so light years apart.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's been a fairly steady divergence, for lack of a better term, but I think it's really rooted in the late 1950s when two factors converged to kind of set bluegrass on a separate course. One was the advent of rock and roll and the way that it took a huge audience away from all kinds of music, including country music. And that was when you had the development of the Nashville sound and kind of more music that was designed to appeal to an older audience and a more diverse, geographically diverse and kind of culturally diverse audience, a pop audience, basically. It's Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves and artists like that who had a more pop influenced sound. So that was one thing that kind of cast a shadow over bluegrass as a more rural kind of music. And then the other at the same time was the folk music revival really got going in the late 50s and early 60s. And they partly under a what I think was kind of a misunderstanding of bluegrass that was catered to by some folks who maybe had a more nuanced understanding, but basically it was presented as a kind of folk music. Bluegrass is front porch, people in the Appalachians sitting out on their front porches, plucking the banjo and whatnot, which is a fine description of old time string band music, maybe, but not bluegrass, which was really a commercial music from its inception, born on the Grand Ole Opry. But so those two, and the folk audience and industry brought that perspective, that sort of they looked at country music of the time, including all the great classic country artists that we revere these days, as just kind of like vulgarized rural music and very commercial and so forth. So famously, I'll just be brief, there's a story. Earl Scruggs first appeared at the Newport Folk Festival with Hilo Brown and not as a member of Flatt and Scruggs, because the people who were booking it thought that the Flatt and Scruggs presentation, and Lester Flatt style in particular, was just kind of too corny and commercial for this folk audience that was primed to respect the virtuosity of Earl's banjo playing, but not so much everything else that was related to country music there. So that sort of the late 50s, early 60s was when they began to diverge, and it's just sort of continued ever since. I will add one quick footnote, which is that if even today, when you look at a fair number of these contemporary commercial country artists, and if you look at who's actually playing in their bands that they take out on the road, you can still find a fair number of bluegrass musicians, which is one of the reasons why Nashville is still such a center for bluegrass music.
Interesting, yeah. This might be a sarcastic question, but is there any hope for what is now called country music?
Yeah. Well, I think yes, but there is what you to the extent that one wants to find that you need to look beyond. There's a kind of upper crust of country music. There are 100 and something radio stations that report to Billboard's airplay chart. The big commercially successful artists are the ones that get played on those stations. And so that definition is kind of the prominent representation of country music. But when you get below that level, there are all kinds of great country artists of every stripe that you can imagine, from very kind of country rock to what we call traditional country music, to Americana. There's really this kind of continuum stretching from the roots music field of old time music and bluegrass and whatnot into the commercial country scene, and there are a lot of great artists at just about every level. So, I think to the extent that the audience for that persists, then I think it will continue to be a solid.
Oh. You still there?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
a solid field.
Yeah. I was thinking, I think about bluegrass, and I think about just even up here, hundreds of bluegrass, small groups playing bluegrass for fun, or maybe a little money, but mostly for fun. But they sound pretty much like the big stars. I mean, the local band sounds like Billy Strings, just not with the same level of quality. But in country music, I think maybe the regional local stuff doesn't really sound like, whoever the big stars of the moment are in country. I mean, it's almost like a separate genre.
It is kind of, and that has its historical roots in my opinion, in the way that country music developed. Nashville became such a center for the industry in the 1950s that it really wound up kind of stunting these local and regional scenes, because if you were an country music artist, and you had any aspirations beyond playing a few gigs around town, instead of building on that and developing a regional circuit and kind of stepping up incrementally, everybody would just pick up and move to Nashville and try and make it there. And so that it's definitely still much more centralized, the country music mainstream, than the bluegrass scene for sure.
Right, right. So you're a guy who's, I know, is highly trained in classical music. I mean, all kinds of music you're familiar with. And yet you're a big figure in a genre, bluegrass, that is almost completely learned by ear and played by ear. I mean, a lot of bluegrass greats through the years and even now really don't even know exactly necessarily what they're doing. They're just playing what they know so beautifully and well from what they learned by ear. I just find that kind of interesting that you, with all that background, are so fond of this music, which is so not trained.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the mystery of art to me. Is you could look at people's backgrounds and maybe predict their interests, their musical interests, but it's very, very inexact. And this is one of the things that, if you think about bluegrass is propagated pretty much all around the world, and and there are individual bluegrass scenes in Czech Republic, in Germany, in Switzerland, in Japan. There's a little scene in India, in Spain, all over the place. And these are people who have no cultural connection to where the music came from, but there's just something about that sound that grabbed them and made them want to explore it more. And the same for me, really. I started out. Like I said, listening to country music as a teenager, and I kind of stumbled across it, and it spoke to me, the sounds and the tones and the textures and all everything about it, honestly.
Could you define bluegrass in one sentence? A lot of people have tried. I mean, Bill Monroe had a classic one. I don't know. It was this and that and this and that all mixed together with little blues and gospel. But I don't know. Would you attempt that?
I have a very unsatisfactory definition of bluegrass for myself, and that is if music is conceived of and recorded and produced and marketed and consumed by listeners as bluegrass, then it's bluegrass. And I mean, it's a very defensible definition, I think. It's a very unsatisfactory one to when folks are kind of accustomed to say, well, it's these instruments and these kinds of songs or whatever. People tend to focus a lot on the instruments, but as somebody who knows a lot about bluegrass and being maybe a little bit contrarian by nature, anytime I hear a definition, my mind goes immediately to counterexamples and counterexamples from the very first and second generation artists who defined the genre. A lot of people are very upset at the notion of using drums in a bluegrass band, but yet if you go back and listen to, Bill Monroe had a drummer of sorts in Ernie Newton, the bass player, who had a drum head mounted on his bass and his brushes in his hand, and so he played the drum. If you listen carefully to a record like My Little Georgia Rose from the early 50s, there's a drum on there. It's not a drum set. Osborne Brothers, Jimmy Martin, Flatt and Scruggs, there were Reno and Smiley. There were a lot of drums in early bluegrass music. So to me, that sort of says you're coming along and imposing if your definition of bluegrass excludes a lot of the music that created it in the first place, then there's a problem with that definition. And I think one of the reasons that bluegrass has survived as a genre and thrived as a genre is because from the very beginning, there was a diversity of sounds and styles that allowed it to grow in a lot of different directions.
I remember a famous quote, which has nothing to do with bluegrass, and I don't have the quote exactly, but the Supreme Court was talking about pornography, and one of the justices says, "I can't really define it, but you know it when you see it." And maybe the same is true about bluegrass.
Yeah, I don't really understand why some people have so much invested in not just creating a definition of bluegrass for themselves, but of trying to impose it on other people. Um, I can't. I mean, I know that exists, but I really can't relate to it. So for instance, Bill Monroe, the original bluegrass band, when Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs were in his band from end of 1946 until the end of 1947, they recorded 28 songs, and of those 28, more than a third have no banjo on them at all. They're gospel songs, The Shining Path and Wicked Path of Sin and things like that. So there's no bluegrass on those. And then of the remainder, another third of those are like fairly slow tunes, like Summertime is Past and Gone, where the banjo is just playing very lightly in the background. And so when we think of bluegrass, fast song, high singing, and the banjo rolling away, there's like 6 or 7 songs that band recorded that fit that description. So there's a lot of diversity in there, even from the archetypal recordings.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's a lot of the early Monroe music, he would have like a swing sound with like walking bass, and it was more tuned into almost the swing era music than bluegrass. So you brought up Earl Scruggs, which I was going to ask you about. So when he and Lester Flatt joined Bill Monroe's band, and obviously it changed the whole world, do you think that was a conscious move by Monroe to come up with a new sound, or it just happened that Earl Scruggs played that way and it just became the sound?
Somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Monroe had a particular idea that he needed that kind of sound. He certainly wasn't looking for it. I think he was intent on making his music as popular and successful and appealing as possible. And he was when he heard Earl play, he realized this is he hired Earl because String Bean had quit the band, and Lester Flatt is purportedly thought there was no need to have a banjo in the band at all. But Jim Shoemate, the fiddle player who had worked with Monroe, was aware of Earl and sort of engineered this. Said, you need to check this kid out, and so Earl was 23. He was really young, and I think people forget that sometimes, just how young he was. And so he went and played with Bill, and Bill hired him, and that was it. And I think Earl told me a few interesting things. One of I guess the most immediately relevant is he said, Bill, he said he had a lot of songs that fit the banjo well. And as a lot of the musical foundation, fast songs and whatnot were already there, but without the banjo. But the banjo sort of pulled it all together and really elevated it.
You mentioned Jim Shoemate. I know you're involved or have been with Zoe and Cloyd, who played up here a few times. And they actually played up here once as a bluegrass band, which was pretty exciting. Not just a duo, but they had the whole banjo and everything else.
Yeah.
So a lot of genres of music. I guess I get your point about defining music, because it doesn't really matter. It's music. You like it, you don't like it, but everybody wants to kind of put a label on everything, which probably is not a good thing. But I mean, many genres of music over the years have had such dramatic stylistic shifts. What do you think about bluegrass that keeps it sounding the same pretty much as it has for 60, 70 years, with some variations? But I mean, you still recognize, Flatt and Scruggs or Stanley Brothers in the music of the bands today, a lot of them. Whereas, rock and jazz and classical have gone way different. Just curious.
Yeah. I don't know that I have a very good answer to that, honestly. You could point to some things. You'd mentioned a while earlier, the way that people typically have learned this music is by emulation, and a huge number of professional bluegrass musicians over the years learned kind of the same way. They maybe learned either somebody showed them how to play. They were in a community where there were some musicians already who could show them things, or maybe they learned from records. There are a lot of people who talk about, you buy a record and slow it down and learn licks off of that. But then once you begin playing, because it's a band music, and maybe that also is a factor, because it's a band music, until relatively recently, pretty much everybody made progress the same way, which is that they learned something about playing, and then they got in some little local band and played with older, more experienced players. And if they were good, then they would move to another better band and move to another better band, and sort of work their way up the ladder until the point where they might go off on their own or find some kind of durable position. So this is I call this an apprenticeship model, right? You're learning from other people. And so that's always been a great way for traditions to be carried on, is that apprenticeship. You learn by listening, you learn by emulating, and particularly with bluegrass, there is this canon of songs that everybody learns. Everybody learns to play Blue Ridge Cabin Home and Your Love Is Like a Flower and Blue Moon of Kentucky and all that kind of stuff. And so there's that common body of musical knowledge that's constantly reinforced, because this is the way. One of the most moving things to me for the 30 years that I've been going to IBMA is every year you will see people jamming together who literally don't speak the same language. Japanese players who have made their way there, or German, or whomever, whose ability to communicate, to converse in English is limited or maybe even non-existent, but they can stand around and play music with other bluegrass people all night long, because everybody's learned those same songs, those same licks, those same gestures. And I think that is one of the things that really helps to keep it together. I just had an interview that I did with Billy Strings, published here last week. And it was one of the things that we talked about was, he said, and he's still anywhere from 30% up of his set list typically are old bluegrass songs from that same canon. And he said the same thing. He said, I never get tired of doing these. I never get tired. And there's a whole body of these songs that we haven't even gotten around to yet. So I just sort of keep dredging them up, and that really does build that common songbook, and this sort of apprenticeship model of learning, I think, helped to create the situation where it progresses and it goes off in all these different directions, and you can certainly find some very edgy stuff. But at the core, the common thing that unites everybody around that are those things.
Billy Strings is a kind of a phenomenon right now. I don't know if bluegrass has ever seen anything quite like Billy Strings in terms of popularity. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, not exactly. Certainly not anything like this. I will say Alton Krauss and Union Station, and some of this is interesting to me. Alton Krauss and Union Station, especially in the late '90s, when Alton won a considerable number of Grammys and had gotten some country airplay and all that. They actually did one or two fairly brief runs. Opening. I want to say they did a few dates opening for Garth Brooks. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's right. And the sound, and they quit mostly out of frustration because the level of technology didn't exist to accurately take the acoustic sounds of their instruments and put them at an arena level. And they were in. I remember in 2003 they were having discussions about possibly doing the same thing with Shania Twain, going out and opening for her, and that was kind of the deal breaker. There really was just the inadequacy of the technology at that time to accurately represent their instruments at that arena level. And that's something that's been basically solved now. So Billy can go out and play to, stadiums and
Right.
and sound like bluegrass. So,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, I think this nobody, to my knowledge, has achieved the level of success that he has, with as much of a straightforward bluegrass sound and the inclusion of so many songs from the bluegrass songbook from the Stanley Brothers and Mac Wiseman and Jimmy Martin, et cetera, that he has. So that really is unique.
Yeah. I saw an interview with him on YouTube recently. He was talking about how little he really knew about music. He played by ear and he played amazingly, but he's like been taking lessons, I guess, and learning a little bit about theory and like finding new ways for his fingers to go in a solo that he never really thought about before. And I thought that was kind of interesting, that even at his level of success, he's still looking to learn.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I mean he's a very um, he has a good sense of kind of who he is and who he isn't, and a real level of humility that I think a lot of people in his position wouldn't necessarily have. But yeah, I mean, he's gone out, he's taken guitar lessons from people, as well as music theory and whatnot. So
Yeah. Yeah. He actually played up here back in 2013 as a backup guitarist for Don Julin. They were touring together, and they did a mandolin workshop at a local music store. So Billy played rhythm guitar for Don, and then they had 20 people at the show. It's just like
yeah,
11 years ago. It's hard to imagine now, but yeah, funny.
yeah,
It's been amazing.
it's quite a ride. But and I think and I see. I belong to a couple of Billy Strings groups on Facebook, and so I kind of keep an eye on fan conversation and fan interest and whatnot. And there is, and this is how bluegrass has always kind of accumulated new listeners and new musicians as well. Is some number of people who go to see a show get onto the internet and say, where did this song come? Where did the baggage coach ahead come from? And who is this Mac Wiseman guy, or who are the Stanley Brothers? And that is going back to what we were talking about, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Same thing, right? You kind of get roped. You hear something that moves you, and you want to learn more. And that is how, like I said, how bluegrass has always kind of replenished its audience and its musicians as well.
It's funny because being a amateur concert promoter, the audience is an older crowd, and we think of bluegrass musicians as being older, but back in the day when they were starting out, they were all young too, right? They were just young and radical and doing what they wanted to do. They weren't, you think of Del McCoury and all these people, they were in their 20s too, right? They were just learning, and it's kind of hard to imagine that these days, because now these elder statesmen, you listen to the music, is, oh yeah, they're old, but at one time they were the young studs.
This is one of the things that there's a story from 1995 until 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. I did a lot of writing about bluegrass music. I wrote a lot of liner notes. I wrote a lot of articles. I wrote a lot of press releases and bios for artists and whatnot. And one of the things that let me do that I treasure as an experience is I got to talk to a huge number of bluegrass artists, contemporary artists, but also I did a long interview with Jimmy Martin, with Ralph Stanley, Earl Scruggs, Earl and Louise Scruggs, Mac Wiseman, the Osborne brothers, Norman Blake. The list kind of goes on and on, and that is exactly right. I mean, these are folks who got started typically when they were younger, and learned and figured stuff out. And the consistent thread that I've heard from the exceptional musicians of every era is, well, I realized, like the banjo players say, well, I listened to a lot of Earl Scruggs and I learned all Earl Scruggs stuff, and then I realized you can't beat a man at his own game, and I had to do something to develop my own style, and that's what I did. And that's true, I think, of every successful bluegrass musician. Is they find they learn from the past, but then at some point they realize they have to branch out and get their own thing going.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because as a promoter, even though it's just a hobby for me, I partially did it to get to meet and hang out with bluegrass musicians.
Mm-hmm.
But as a promoter, you don't really have much time to do that, especially because it was me and my family. That was it. And we, did all the setup and everything else. So while everyone's chatting with, Tony Rice and Doyle Lawson, I'm there cleaning up and putting the food away and putting the seats. So that was always the hardest part for me, was not really having the time, because musicians, they like to hang out after the show and talk a little bit. Then they want to go and to their hotel and get something to eat and rest. So that was always a little bit frustrating. That's why I like the podcast. The podcast, I can talk for an hour plus to people and with no interruption. So it's kind of nice.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking back about the influences on bluegrass. Obviously, Bill Monroe, and I always, in my mind, think that Tony Rice is, I wouldn't say up there with Bill Monroe, but certainly one of the two or three major influences on the way bluegrass is today. Because I learned about bluegrass through Tony Rice. I never even heard Bill Monroe until I was in my 40s. So I don't know. What do you think about that? About Tony Rice's influence, aside from Bill Monroe and the kind of the sound that's become bluegrass?
Oh, well, I think he's a huge influence, and he really belongs right up there with the a handful of names who really made this music what it is, and particularly for Tony Rice recorded a lot of different kinds of music in the course of his career, and it's interesting to see how different aspects of his discography, so to speak, have kind of influenced different sectors of bluegrass. But he certainly revolutionized flat picking, lead guitar playing in bluegrass. His sense of rhythm and his rhythm guitar playing, I think, were enormously influential as well. And you can point. When you listen to Tony Rice playing straight ahead bluegrass, you can hear his influences. You can certainly hear a lot of Jimmy Martin's rhythm lick, and especially when you go back and listen to Tony from his earlier days. But that his approach to traditional and contemporary bluegrass music, bluegrass in particular, has been profoundly influential. Those bluegrass album band records are just there are a lot of people who've learned all their classics of their repertoire, not from Bill Monroe and Flat Scruggs and the Stanley Brothers and Reno and Smiley and Jimmy Martin and the Osborne Brothers, but from the bluegrass album band recordings. And it's interesting to me in that one of the reasons they made those records was that a lot of the original stuff was out of print. And so this was a way of kind of bringing these songs back into the mainstream in these fresh new arrangements. And these days, due to just kind of the peculiarities of the recorded music business and the shift to streaming, is once again, there's a lot of stuff that you can't hear that is hard to find. Although most of the Osborne Brothers Decca catalog, which is a huge amount of their great recordings, is not available on streaming platforms. Jimmy Martin is another example. A lot of Monroe stuff is not available. So there could be room for a new kind of bluegrass album band. But if there is, when people revisit the classics, a lot of times as they record them at least, or even if you just go see a live performance, you realize, okay, no, actually they got that song not from Flat Scruggs, but from the Bluegrass album, from Tony Rice. And so, I mean, he's really had a profound influence in that respect.
I mean, when you put it that way, Billy Strings and his cohorts might be the new bluegrass album band, maybe.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to be said for that. And I will say one of the interesting things that I realized when I first started writing with him was that I would say most bluegrass flat pickers, uh, they learned their Doc Watson and their Clarence White through Tony Rice playing Doc Watson songs and Clarence White songs, et cetera. And Billy's a little unusual in that because of the way he grew up and what his dad was playing for him, he got his Doc Watson straight from the source. And you can tell if you listen to him play, Way Downtown or something like that, it's really plain if you have the perception at all that he did not get this. His picking style is still more Doc Watson than it is Tony Rice, and that really kind of makes him stand out to me.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've talked to people in this podcast and asked them questions like, how much of your musical style is based on your limitations and what you could actually do? I mean, everybody would like to be able to play anything on any instrument, but obviously you're limited by your technique and your fingers and your imagination. And I think Tony Rice, to a degree, kind of like his hero Oscar Peterson, was limited in a sense that he had a vocabulary. It wasn't limitless, and it affected his probably playing of Doc Watson and everybody else because that's just the way he did it.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. I was talking to Doyle Lawson on this at one point, and when he was in the Bluegrass album band, he said, my main job was finding songs for the band. That was what they sent me out. Said, you find the songs. And he said, I love doing it because, I'd bring 15 songs and they'd say, no. Oh, we'll try that one. And he said that was one of his main jobs back then.
There's another guy who's had a profound impact on bluegrass music over the last 50 years now is Doyle Lawson.
Yeah. I remember I had a sound guy here, so we had set up a sound system for his band to come up. This was maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And so a couple of his guys came in, bass player and big guys. I hardly knew who they were. And they started taking the sound system down. And my sound guy got all upset. What the hell are you guys doing? They said, oh, we brought our own sound system. And it almost came to blows, but then they calmed things over because they just came in and started taking it apart without even saying anything. It was like, oh my goodness. That was a funny one. Anyway, I don't know. You might not remember. You played up here at Guitar Town with David Peterson. I think it was back in 2010 or 11 or so. He had his country band with Mark Thornton and Brandon Godman. And David's an interesting guy. I got to know him. He played up here a lot for Guitar Town. I got to know him pretty well until it became impossible. The travel was just ridiculous for that thing. But he and I have really probably opposite views on many, many things. But I feel like the Bluegrass family welcomes everybody in as long as music is kind of the front and center, I guess I would say. Because I don't really delve into people's political beliefs or whatever they believe about stuff. We have a common subject, which is music, and it always seems to like it's a big tent, but I don't think you want to get too deep into anyone's stuff. That's my sense.
No, I think that's right. Especially over the last 10 years or so, I've been kind of fond of saying, one of the big selling points, one of the praise points in bluegrass against repeated regulars, bluegrass brings people of every different kind together, and we found out how true that is. And it's certainly it's an industry and a community that isn't immune from isn't isolated from the rest of the world, and so there have certainly been some some clashes, for lack of a better term, and a kind of sorting um, where people are finding they're more comfortable with folks who share more of their views, backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's natural and inevitable to some extent, but I think it's also really important. I've made an album in 2018 with a young banjo player named Justin Hiltner, and Justin is probably the most prominent gay bluegrass musician around. And we wanted to make, and the album, it's all original songs that he and I wrote, but it's basically, it's I wouldn't call it traditional. It's not retro, but it's mainstream bluegrass. There aren't songs with a lot of chords. It's a bluegrass band with upright bass and flat top guitar and banjo and fiddle and mandolin. And the songs are all very much in the bluegrass vein. And he and I made that with two different bands. One band included Casey Campbell and Karina Longston Stevens from High Fidelity, who's a super traditional player, and a great guitar player and singer-songwriter, actually, named Amanda Fields. And then the other half was made with Molly Tuttle and Tristan Scroggins and Brandon Godwin playing fiddle. And so we wanted, we wanted to make this album for original songs, but one of the things that we wanted the project to kind of illustrate was that that a lot of times I think people tend to think of the style divide and a generational divide or a cultural divide as all lining up the same way. So if you're politically conservative and older, then you're a traditional bluegrass person. And if you're a progressive bluegrass person, it means you're young, you're liberal, and more eclectic and progressive minded in all respects. And I don't think that's true. And I think it's important that we remind people and show people that it's not true by bringing folks of different backgrounds and whatnot together to play these different kinds of music. Bluegrass is really a multi-dimensional sort of grid, and people can locate depending on what the axes are that you identify. People can line up in a lot of different places with respect to culture, politics, gender, age, and style.
Yeah. As you know, we recently had Trey Wellington play up here with his band, and yeah. I didn't know you would produce his albums, but Trey is an interesting guy. He's a black banjo player, progressive, obviously. How did you meet up or get together with Trey? Did he find you to work on his albums? Did you find him, or?
It was kind of mutual. I actually met Trey when he was in 2019, I want to say. He was playing with Cane Mill Road, and I was playing with Chris Jones and the Night Drivers, and we both appeared at the Provo Ogden Music Festival out in Utah. And so I got to know him a little bit then, and then he was going to App State. I forget where he was going to school, but he was in Western North Carolina. He was living in Western North Carolina, and he reached out to me and to Ty Gilpin, who also works at Mountain Home Music, to really just kind of talk about music business and marketing and whatnot. He had just put out an EP self-released an EP, and we got to talking, and over the course of several conversations, we thought, well, this is a great opportunity to sign. I mean, he's a tremendous musician. I think he's going to go a long ways, and we were happy to have the opportunity to work with him. So that's how that happened.
Yeah. I was going to get into, I haven't really gotten into producing albums or songwriting. I think we have to have another interview another time. 'Cause I had 5 pages here and I'm only through 2. I have so many, I guess that's the problem with interviewing someone like you that has so many interests and so much experience that I can't get to it all in one time. But I was going to ask you if you could have sat down and had a beer with anybody in the past history of bluegrass music just to shoot the breeze, who would that have been for you?
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. It's a tough question to answer simply because I really had the chance to converse with so many people that to think of folks that I didn't, like I said, I will say one of the most fascinating conversations that I had. And if I hadn't, he would definitely be at the top of my list, or they would be at the top of my list. It was with Earl and Louise Scruggs in 2005. The Country Music Hall of Fame Museum did a big exhibit on the Banjo Man. But what was nice was it really encompassed his whole career, and so it included his family, and it included Louise Scruggs, who of course managed Flat Scruggs, and then Earl Scruggs Review, and then Earl Scruggs, and I remember it was funny because I had asked for an hour for the interview, which I figured would be plenty, and it wound up getting scheduled on the day when I had to move. I was moving from one house to another house, and I went over to their house. They were living in the house that once had been owned by George Jones and Tammy Wynette down in Nashville. And I went over and we sat at the kitchen table, and they were so gracious. And Earl was in a talkative mood, and so was Louise. And so an hour came and went, and we were just getting going. And so another hour came and went, and they were still going strong. And I think we wound up talking for 3 hours, and I was the one that had to cut it off, which so I could go finish moving. I really hated to do that, but we covered so much ground, and to be able to talk to somebody with that kind of, and he has a good memory, and as Louise did as well, and so it's just to really kind of dig in and get those questions that everybody has. Well, how do you come up with this lick? What did he realize how groundbreaking what he was doing was? So the chance to really have that kind of conversation was just wonderful. I treasure it very much.
Yeah. Did he realize that, or was he just playing what he loved and knew? Did he realize his importance at the time, or?
Yes and no. They knew, and this is why he and Lester quit the band. Was they knew how much money Monroe was making, because they were counting the money after every show and then handing it over to Bill and getting a little bit of it back in their pay. So musically, he was very modest musically, and it was interesting. He said at one point, he said, I just thought that my role would fit with a lot of different kinds of music. And this made me think, because most musicians, if you think about this, most musicians, if they're playing outside their comfort zone, I'm a country musician and I go and play with some jazz guys, I'm going to change what I'm doing to suit that style of music. And I'm going to adapt what I do to fit into this situation. And that was not Earl. Whatever he was doing, you can listen to any record that Earl Scruggs is on. And no matter, like the last album they did, the Earl Scruggs and Friends, where he had Elton John and I forget who all, the country and pop stars and all that. If you listen to what Earl is doing, he's playing that same role that he did everywhere to everything, and he said, this thing of mine is really good. It's going to fit in a lot of different places. And that's a very unusual and kind of self-assured, not egotistical, but just, I know this is going to fit attitude that's rare.
I mean, I never met him or heard him live, but he struck me as a modest man, but obviously a man who knew his talent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it.
I just want to talk briefly about Al Anderson, who has become a big songwriting star in Nashville. But he in Connecticut, we grew up listening to Big Al on the guitar in a band called the Wild Weeds, and he used to play around the state when he was a teenager in all these black nightclubs, and folks would come in and hear him and say, "Oh my God, I always thought he was a black guy," because he had such a soulful. I mean, he was an amazing guitarist and singer, and very soulful. Of course, now he's become a big country songwriter with a lot of success. Yeah. And one of the songs I love that he wrote, which is done by Bronwyn Keith Hines, is "Trip Around the Sun." She's played up here a lot when she was with the Mile 12 band before she moved down there and met Jason, hooked up with Molly Tuttle, and now she's doing really well for herself. But yeah, she does a nice job on that song. Why did you decide to leave Nashville? Were you just done with it?
Pretty much, I moved there at the end of 2002, and I met my wife. I lived in Nashville when I first moved there. I met my wife in 2007, and we got married, and she was working up in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And so we moved to basically to White House, Tennessee, which is kind of midway between Nashville and always thought that, when she retires, we'll move back into Nashville and sort of pick up there. But by the mid-teens, by 2015, 2016, in there, it became apparent that we couldn't afford to move any closer to Nashville because, it's just the city's blown up and real estate prices have blown up with them. And by that point, in 2016, I was playing with Chris Jones still. Chris lives up in northern Canada, in northern Alberta. The banjo player that we had at the time, Gina Furtado, lived in Winchester, Virginia, and the mandolin player, Mark Stoffel, lived in southern Illinois. So it was, when I started with Chris, it was Chris and me and Ned Luberecki, and we were all there in Nashville. So it was a Nashville-based band. By 2016, it was no longer Nashville-based in any meaningful way. So there was no particular advantage to me living there, and I sort of tested out this proposition that I could travel and I could make writing appointments and travel to go write with people, that was a realistic thing. And so at that point, we started thinking about moving away from Nashville. And then when the record label offered me the job here, Western North Carolina was one of the few places that we could agree on, because I do not like humid weather, and my wife did not like cold weather. So that narrows down the available options. So Western North Carolina was kind of in our sights already. And when they offered me the job, I thought this would be a great opportunity.
Yeah. Have you thought about writing a book about the history of music or bluegrass, or you feel like you're still too much involved in it to really be objective about it, or is that something that's on your list?
I am. It is not. I was approached some years ago about writing a book, basically what would amount to a sequel to Neil Rosenberg's book Bluegrass, A History, which is the standard account of the music up through about 1985. And so this is maybe almost 20 years ago now. So there was another 20 plus years of history to be looked at. And I thought a lot about it as an attractive proposition, but I decided I did not have the time and energy to do it. And so I don't know. It's possible I might revisit it at some point, but what I have been working on intermittently is collecting. I have this vast amount of stuff that I've written, all those liner notes and articles and whatnot. And I'm thinking at some point when I have a little more time, when I'm not working full time, that a collection of that might be of some interest to folks. Because, like I said, I mean, there's stuff about everybody, and especially my philosophy as a writer when I was writing all these articles for Bluegrass Today and Bluegrass Now and No Depression was to let my interview subjects speak pretty much for themselves. So my writing was actually 70%, 80% quotes, just letting these musicians tell their stories, and just really my job was to elicit it and then sort of arrange it to make, because people in a open-ended interview and a conversation, they'll take up a subject and then they'll go on and talk about something else and talk about something else, and then they'll circle back to that first thing that they were talking about. So as a writer, if you cut and paste so that all of the stuff on one subject is together in one place, and then here's another topic and so forth, it makes for a good read. But it's all still in their words, and so I'm hopeful to get a collection out at some point.
I would enjoy that. I think that's something that people would really be interested in, rather than just somebody opining about the history of music and who was more valuable and who did this and who did that. I mean, I think talking like I do here. I mean, I've always tried, and I learned this over doing this a little bit. It's like the best thing to do is ask a question and just shut up and let people talk.
Yep.
It's hard to do. I find myself, I listen back to my first podcast, I'm going, yeah, and I'm agreeing with them all the time, and just be quiet.
Yeah.
It's very hard to do.
Yeah.
So any project you want to give us a sneak preview on before?
Well, I will say we just released. I'm excited about. I did a session back 3 years ago now, 4 years ago. I started producing a great singer-songwriter named Aaron Burdett, and we recorded an album called Dream Rich Dirt Poor over a period of time, and he had some success with singles off of that. And we started work on, got him back in the studio and recorded a couple more things. And then he was invited to join the Steep Canyon Rangers when Woody Platt left the band. And that sort of put his solo stuff on the back burner for a couple of years, actually. And but a few months ago, we got back in the studio, me and I played bass. He's a great guitar player. And we've got Kristen Scott Benson on banjo and Tristan Scroggins on mandolin and Carly Arrowwood on fiddle, and cut 4 tracks. We just released one. But I was so happy with this session. There's some great music. It's exciting to think that he maybe will get more attention, more visibility now as a result of his gig with the Steep Canyon Rangers. So look for more music from Aaron Burdett to be coming out in the early part of next year. I'm excited about that. We have a couple of other signings that we'll be announcing, I think, early in 2025. Some artists that we'll be picking up on the label, and I'm excited about that too. Lot going on.
Nice. Well, people listening to this podcast episode are going to go, why didn't you ask him about songwriting or record producing? Because those are like, I have 2 whole pages of questions about that, which we never got to. So I think I'd like to have you on again and talk about that aspect of your life at some point. I would be interested. I think people would. I mean, we covered a lot today. You obviously have a lot of knowledge and experience and ideas about all this stuff, and it's fun to hear. But I'd like to talk more about that side of your career at some point, if you would be willing
Absolutely.
to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Jon Weisberger, for taking time. I've learned a lot today. It's been a fascinating conversation with you, and it's been a pleasure. And I will be talking to you again soon, I promise.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me again. I really enjoyed it.
You're very welcome. Talk soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast, and thanks for listening. Visit our website, guitartownct.com, for concert and podcast schedules, or just to send us a message. We'd love to hear from you.